Okay. So can I come back on that? I mean, just make sure we got that absolutely clear. Clearly, identification of what constitutes value for the client and for the end user is extremely important part of the whole process. You're saying that maybe many clients, or increasingly clients these days, are more astute at determining what constitutes value within their projects, and that what they see as value is quite complex.
I think that if someone was going to take a learning point away from this session, the idea that value is a single point, dispelling that would be a good learn. There was an interesting piece of work done out of Loughborough University a few years ago, which tried to put the idea of value through a prism of a client organisation's values. And so everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with the equation that value is effectively the outputs over the inputs. So if you want X square metres of warehouse space and it costs Y per metre squared, if you can get it for less, then that's greater value. Now, that's 10 years ago, that description would have been fairly challenging to quite a few design teams when you were actually trying to do a value management session. We were trying to say, well, let's see all the things that this building does, and then we'll see how much they cost. Once it starts rolling in some of the wider agendas that people have, it gets all the more complex. I think it's worthwhile just thinking about how a public sector organisation and a private sector organisation might see value, because they have effectively different chains of end users. They have different pressures. If we take something, for example, the health sector, in the end, value in health comes from people being healthier. So it means that it might be people recovering from operations more quickly. So in many ways, the idea that a health facility can be delivered for X pounds per metre squared is quite clear. It's pointing people in a different direction. But in reality, health is delivered in an internal market, so that a health trust will get a certain amount of money for a procedure. So that they're in a bit of a balance between, on one side, having to deliver project very cost effectively, at the same time thinking about how can we ensure that these people leave the hospital first time, they don't come back, so we don't have to do more things to them costing us money for which we won't get an income. And of course they've also got this wider agenda about sustainability, looking after their community and such like. So there's a very complex agenda in the public sector, which usually somewhere has a pretty sharp affordability angle in it. And it's not just about cost per metre squared versus building, it's about what's the throughput. If one thinks about the private sector, we might have a client operating in a deeply commoditised market. So if one was to think about distribution or retail, these are people who have probably been operating in a deflationary market for the best part of 10 years. So their focus has been to drive cost out where they can, wherever they can, whilst maintaining the fundamental value of what drives their business. So in terms of retail, it's probably about providing as much of a retail offer as you possibly can, broadening that offer and making sure the stuff is on the shelves when you need it. And actually the building is a bit of an adjunct to that. But as we move on, of course, we now see that even the retailers are having to respond to sustainability, because their agenda widens away from just being presenting lots of food now to being providing lots of food in effectively a responsible way. So Marks and Spencer's Plan A, delivered in a extremely robust commercial way, because of course it was driven as part of a recovery programme, is also about demonstrating that it has a commitment to the environment that its clients would value. One thinks about an office developer, again a different set of values. What they're trying to do is anticipate firstly what their market might want in 2-3 years' time, what the market might be. So if you're in central London, one might be thinking, are we going to have, well, you would have been thinking, will we have bank occupiers? Are we going to have lawyers? Probably wouldn't be thinking so far. And what do they need, and how do those things differ? And then what might they need in 10, 15 years' time? And so they're trying to almost create headroom for people to expand the way in which they change their business. So very complicated set of relationships, and that's one of the reasons why we try to specialise, because in that way you'll get somebody who's attuned to further education, higher education, health, or the private sector in offices. So
again, it's a further explanation of the diversity and variety of people and approaches that exist within your organisation, which is a reflection of the growing complexity of the markets that you serve and individual clients that you serve.
I think that's a fair comment. It raises an interesting question in terms of Davis Langdon compared to the rest of the industry. Cost consultancy project management is probably distinguished by having a very high degree of polarisation between very large practices and very small practices. Other parts of the industry, for example, design practices, most of those are much smaller than ourselves. So actually you can start to see there's a greater potential for specialisms within design practices that you wouldn't necessarily see in a cost consultancy practice. So a local design practice to here, for example, Field and Clegg Bradley, have a very strong reputation in education. Other practices, sort of Anshin Dar, for example, have a very strong reputation in health. So you can see specialisation sometimes appears in the way in which organisations have chosen to sort of work in particular sectors. And then once you get to start to see the larger consultants such as ourselves or large contractors, then they then have to span these sectors, because that's the way in which we get our work. And at that point you need to think about how you best focus your people in a particular way.